area, half the world's population, and many of the most powerful militaries on Earth. Here's Thomas Kincaid on the left with General MacArthur on board the flagship of the time, Nashville, USS Nashville, and here's an artist rendition of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is just to show the connection pardon me, between the United States and Japan. Here, U.S. and Japanese sailors are jointly celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1960 Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and Japan. Just to reinforce my point that the U.S. Navy's presence in the Far East, we controlled the sea, we do control the sea, and that's been a major factor. Here we have, this is an interesting story in regard to the U.S.-Japanese connection. Admiral Nimitz, as you all know here, I'm sure, the great leader of the Pacific War, World War II, as a young lieutenant, was at the funeral of Admiral Togo, the Japanese admiral who won the great victory in the Russo-Japanese War at Strait of Tsushima. His flagship, the Mikasa, was kept as a museum ship by the Japanese before and during the war. Well, in 1945, the powers that be said, let's scrap this ship, let's get it out of here. Admiral Nimitz, to his credit, still, well, he might have been CNO at that point. He was Pac Fleet, but he said, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep this ship. It's important to the Japanese, and he respected Admiral Togo. He always admired him. So come ahead to 2009, and the ship needed some repairs, some restoration work. USS Nimitz was in port. And some wise head said, well, let's get some of the crew down there to help repair the ship, do some painting and whatever else was needed. So that connection continues. As some of you who have served in Japan may know, every year we have the Black Ships Festival, which is held in Shimoda, where Admiral Perry came ashore in 1853. So that connection is very strong and even stronger with recent events. Behind the shield provided by the Navy, not only economic prosperity, but political prosperity has been an after effect. If you think about the countries, some of our allies, and their political progress throughout the Cold War and afterward, you had dictators on Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, you had Park Chung-hee in South Korea, you had Marcos in the Philippines. So some folks would consider those odious regimes because they were dictatorships. But behind that shield, these governments were able to evolve. The democratic systems were able to evolve under our protection and their own forces as well. Another thing, and I've dealt with this in my work on the Vietnam War, one of the things was the Navy's effectiveness in dealing with communist movements, Marxist Leninist movements. And I think one of the important factors that Marxism really did not prosper in the Philippines or anywhere else in the Far East was the fact that our fleet was there. And any budding Marxist Leninist movements were starved of support ultimately, and their own governments were able to take care of it. The same did not apply ashore, obviously in Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Along with more recent developments, I think the Seventh Fleet, including its sailors and Marines, have helped to stem some of the terrorist movements that have developed in Southeast Asia. You remember the Abu Sayyaf, right after 9/11, Abu Sayyaf, very active in the Philippines, southern Philippines, and in Indonesia, the Islamiyah. I've got the name wrong. I'm sorry? Jamal Islamiyah, that's right. Both very active, blowing up ferries, capturing tourists, the Burnhams. Remember Gracie Burnham and her husband? He was killed in the rescue effort. And that was a serious factor. In fact, right after the operation in Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, you had Operation Enduring Freedom P, which is Philippines. Didn't get a lot of play, but our Navy and our other armed forces were in there very quickly to help with the local Philippine military to get back support from the people in the South. to the point now where Abu Sayyaf, I wouldn't say it's dead. Most of its leaders and its adherents are dead, but it's greatly diminished. The same thing with Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia. The locals have taken care of their terrorist problem. We can't say we did that. They did it, but we certainly helped. In addition to the alliances, the 5 formal alliances we have with these Western Pacific nations, we have connections with all the countries in the area. In any given year, more than 100 exercises are conducted by the Seventh Fleet. Either they're joint exercises, multinational exercises with single countries, with multiple countries. You might have heard that an invitation has been tendered to the People's Liberation Army Navy to take part in RIMPAC. That's the annual Pacific-wide exercise. And so this goes on all the time, all over the area, multiple exercises of one kind or another to solidify that connection with these countries. Anti-piracy, anti-terrorism, and working on stopping the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is also a very important function of the Seventh Fleet. Just to give one example, in the period from 2000 to 2005, there were some 2,500 incidents of piracy in the South China Sea, mostly through the Strait of Malacca and in that area. It was a serious problem and growing. But by the end of the decade, not just through our efforts, but through the efforts of Malaysia and Singapore and Japan, very concerned about threats to their ocean-going commerce, that has been pretty much dealt with. Now, there's still pirates out there. They still seize tankers on occasion or kidnap and take over cargoes, but it's the aberration rather than the rule. We're involved in a whole alphabet soup of programs with many of these countries. One in particular is the CARAT, C-A-R-A-T, and that's a combined action against terrorism. Southeast Asia, CCAT is another one, and that's cooperation against terrorism. We work very closely with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations to tamp down piracy, to deal with weapons proliferation and the rest. Those are ongoing and they happen day after day. We also, the U.S. Navy has been a partner in collective security actions. The biggest one, the first one really, was the Korean War. This was a UN-sponsored war. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization did not last out the Vietnam War, but during that time we were an active member, and the Seventh Fleet was an active member in SEATO's operations. Desert Storm, again, this was a UN-sponsored operation in which the Seventh Fleet figured prominently. East Timor, okay, 1999. Randy Papadopoulos here has written extensively about that topic. We were in the back seat. The Australians had the lead, but the Seventh Fleet was part of the operation to bring peace, stability to East Timor in its bid to be free of Indonesia. A very successful operation. We don't have to lead all the time, but we're there to be players. And as I mentioned, pirates. Even the People's Liberation Army Navy has taken part in anti-piracy operations, mostly in the Horn of Africa. But their hearts are in it. Seventh Fleet commanders. Now again, this goes to the diplomatic or the political aspect of what the Seventh Fleet has done. Well, let me just go through a few slides here. Here's an Australian ship and a U.S. naval vessel operating together. And here we have Marines coming ashore from a Seventh Fleet landing craft in the Philippines for exercise Balikatan, shoulder to shoulder. Leaders, as I mentioned, leaders have been very important to what we're trying to do in the Far East, and they've served as scholars or scholars in uniform. They've met with heads of state, as you see here on the left, Admiral Alfred M. Pride, who was commander of Seventh Fleet during the Taiwan Strait Crisis of 1955, meeting with Chiang Kai-shek. I love his cape. Nobody wears capes anymore in the military, but And to the right, it's a meeting with Vice Admiral John M. Byrd, who was commander of 7th Fleet. In fact, a little aside, Admiral Byrd, who went on to become Deputy Director of the Navy Staff, he's since retired, but he was really the godfather of my book, the project to get this started on a history of the 7th Fleet. It was surprising to him, in fact, it was surprising to me, that no other author has treated the entire 7th Fleet story from beginning to end. So this is my shot at it. A lot more certainly could be done. This photo on the right shows Admiral Byrd and Admiral Park of the Republic of Korea Navy initialing an agreement where at some point in the near future, and the date keeps slipping, the South Korean Navy, the Republic of Korea Navy, would take over wartime responsibility for fighting the bad guys from the north. We would be in a supporting role. This is reversing the roles. As I say, it may be finalized by 2014, but I'm not sure what the end date is. The other leaders who have earned their spurs as commanders 7th Fleet, and there have been 5 who have gone on to be chiefs of naval operations to show what that early experience as COM 7th Fleet did for their careers and what they did to help benefit the country. Tom Moore was a 7th Fleet commander, James L. Holloway, Tom Hayward, Carlisle Trost, and Admiral Jonathan Greenert, the current C&O. All were COM 7th Fleet. Many of the COM 7th Fleets, and there were 48 of them to this point, went on to become head of the Pacific Fleet and then Pacific Command. And one, Tom Moore, of course, became chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Very important to their development as leaders, diplomats, if you will, too. Another factor I want to mention is the fleet's use of soft power. I'm forgetting who coined that term, but it's very apt. Naval presence, showing the flag, and that's the current Navy slogan, Global Force for Good. It relates to this. We're trying to show the world that we don't have horns, that we're out there doing the right things. We have shared values. We believe in universal human rights and democracy and international law, all the good things. In that regard, in any given year, there are multiple visits of ships and other 7th Fleet entities to places in the Far East. Some 240 port visits to 70 cities in 20 countries in the last year or so. Here we have an image of Admiral Greenert, Japanese citizens going on board George Washington, the forward deployed aircraft carrier now operating out of Yokosuka. Another important use of fleet visits and other contacts with other countries is to show former enemies that we don't have horns, or we're not ogres, that we have many of their shared values, hopefully, and it just breeds more understanding on both sides. Here we have commanding officer of the USS Blue Ridge, which is the flagship of the 7th Fleet, visiting Zhanjiang in South China. That's the home of the South China Fleet, and meeting with local PLAN officers. Here's another with Admiral Byrd. You can see him. He is not goose-stepping. He's in the back row. He's on a visit to Vladivostok in the Russian Far East. They still have the goose-step from the old days. And here is Commander Hung Ba-le speaking with the media in Da Nang. He's a commanding officer of the USS Lassen. Now this has many connections to Vietnam, our former enemy in Vietnam. His father was in the Republic of Vietnam Navy, who operated out of Da Nang. The ship that he commands, the USS Lassen, is named for a Medal of Honor recipient Clyde Lassen, a search and rescue pilot who earned that medal for very brave exploits. And the last connection, and this is a personal one, he's a graduate of Garfield High School from Woodbridge, Virginia, and a classmate of my oldest son. So he's done very well for himself, and I've heard he was on the 7th Fleet staff recently, and he's an up-and-comer, so you may see more of Hung Ba-le. A big thing that's gone on from day one of the fleet's history, every day, all over the place, and gets very little notice, really, but all the things that the Navy and the military in general have done in regard to refugee evacuations, disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, Seabees going into a country and helping build schools and orphanages and that sort of thing. Thousands and thousands of episodes every year. Here's one example of the so-called Passage to Freedom, evacuation of refugees from northern Vietnam to southern Vietnam in 1954-55. Some 293,000 folks who did not want to live under Ho Chi Minh's government, we brought them south. I wondered how these people feel about cigarette ashes falling into their drinks that they're being served, but his heart was in the job.